Hello friends and welcome back to Train BJJ. My name's Kenny and today I want to answer the question, why Jiu-Jitsu? This was prompted by a tweet that I saw just a few days ago from Huron Gracie, and incidentally you can follow me on Twitter at BrokenBJJ. But Huron just tweeted, why Jiu-Jitsu? And there were a number of answers that people gave, and I thought it's something that I should talk about a bit. My interest in Jiu-Jitsu goes back to really 1993-94 when I first became aware of the UFC. At the time, I was already quite a hardcore wrestling fan, and by that I don't mean a fan of what's now known as hardcore wrestling, but I was very deep into my fandom. I was trading tapes, getting stuff from Japan, Mexico, and some of the independent promotions around the US. I was reading magazines and newsletters and fanzines. I knew a bit about what was going on behind the scenes in wrestling at the time. So I knew, probably more than most people did at that time, exactly how the wrestling business really worked. And of course I was a fan of some of the more interesting kinds of wrestling. I wasn't really a huge fan of the WWF as it was at the time. I liked WCW a bit more, I liked Smoky Mountain and ECW, and I loved a lot of Japanese wrestling. And at the time, one of the hottest Japanese promotions was the UWFI, which is famously where Nobuhiko Takada was the big star. Also, there were things like Pancrase around, rings, PWFG, these so-called shoot-style promotions in Japan. And it's something that a lot of people probably don't understand very much, but in Japan the distinction between pro wrestling and real fighting is a lot more blurry than it is in the US. Even in the UK, up until the mid to late 80s when wrestling was taken off TV here, everybody was required pretty much to be able to shoot. There was catch wrestling, of course, in Wigan, which was something I was aware of. There was, and then going back in the history of American wrestling, you had guys like Lou Thesz, Gene LaBelle, all these guys who were legitimate fighters who really knew how to grapple and how to submit people. In Japan, that had not that separation between the show business type of wrestling and real fighting wrestling hadn't really happened. So UWFI was not real, but had a very realistic vibe to it. It was presented as real. The kicks were heavier than you might see in other types of wrestling, and virtually every match ended in a submission. There weren't really pinfalls in that kind of fighting. There was also Pancrase, which, contrary to popular belief, was not always real. My friend Rob Butcher, I remember, commented that how weird it was that on the first show every match ended in under 2 minutes, and then on the second show most of the matches went 10 to 15 minutes. He said that was kind of when you knew that it wasn't all entirely legitimate. Pancrase, I should say, became much more legitimate later in its time, but in the early days there was certainly a bit of jiggery-pokery happening behind the scenes. So I was very much into all of that, and then the UFC came along. And of course the early UFCs featured pro wrestlers. Ken Shamrock had been a star in Pancrase, but he had also been just a regular pro wrestler round about the smaller independent companies in the US. And Dan Severn, one of my absolute heroes in the early days of the UFC, was a guy who was big in the UWFI. He was such a decorated amateur. He just fit in very well there. And as I say, Dan Severn, absolute superstar. Wonderful professional wrestler, wonderful amateur wrestler, wonderful fighter, and a really, really great guy. But so I was aware of all of these things when the UFC came along. And at first I was suspicious, as, you know, I was a young teenager, and I had kind of taken a while to come to terms with the showbiz nature of professional wrestling. And so I suspected that the UFC might just be a marketing exercise. We all knew that there were, the guys with the dim mak and all these kind of things, these martial arts frauds that are now, exposed very well by channels like McDojo Life. But fairly quickly, I came to understand that it was real. It really was real. And this little skinny Brazilian guy really was a better fighter than all these karate guys, sumo guys, boxers. That jiu-jitsu somehow was able to overcome all of these other styles and triumph in a truly no-holds-barred kumite, something like what we'd seen in the Frank Dukes legends in Bloodsport and all these kind of things. That jiu-jitsu actually was real. And I was doing a little bit of karate then myself, and so I was reading martial arts magazines, and I was kind of really interested in what was going on. And at the time, as I said, I was learning about all this connection with older forms of pro wrestling, the old hookers and shooters who were the biggest stars back in the day. Traditionally in pro wrestling, you had to be a legitimate fighter, because what happens if somebody wasn't willing to cooperate? Sometimes you had to be able to force him into a submission hold and make him legitimately submit, because there was always that fear, that risk. Whether that risk was as real as some of those guys like to pretend and like to tell themselves is a different question. But that was how I got to be aware of BJJ. Now, at the time, I already had quite bad problems with my knees. I did play a bit of rugby at school, but I was never good. I was never able to run very well, and my eyesight was already iffy. I'm not blind or anything, but I'm quite short-sighted, and so I couldn't see balls coming out of the air towards me. I couldn't see my teammates very clearly if I needed to make a pass. So I was not good at rugby. And even though I would, kick about a football with friends, and we would occasionally go on bike rides and whatnot, I always got very sore, very tired very quickly. My knees were just not very, very good. And so by the end of school, by the end of high school, which was 95, 96, I really kind of gave up on exercise. It just seemed that everything was more effort than it was worth for me. But I did keep an eye on the UFC. I watched less while I was at university, but I did keep an eye on what was happening. I did look for results. Obviously, the internet was just starting to grow then. This is back in the mid-90s. And I kept aware of what was going on. But it never seemed like something that was available to me, because at the time there was no BJJ in Scotland. There were certainly no coaches, and even seminars were very few and far between. I do remember at one point in the late 90s, Hoist Gracie did come to do a seminar in Glasgow. I was at university in Aberdeen. It's only 2.5 hours away, give or take. But the money, the travel, and really the kind of fear that I didn't know what I was doing, I wasn't in good shape, I wasn't physically strong or anything like that, I thought, maybe that's not for me. And so I never did try then. And then as the years went on, my knees became more and more of a problem. My hips started to get sore. And so I got into the 2000s, and I moved back to Glasgow, and I was aware that there were some jiu-jitsu available as the years went on. There are a few gyms in Glasgow. One of them, you can see it. It's fairly near the middle of town, and it's quite prominent. So I knew it was there, but again, I had other priorities. Trying to find a job, trying to have a social life, trying to make new friends in Glasgow, and just enjoying life. It wasn't really something that was at the top of my agenda. But then about probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, I started getting more and more back into the UFC. Actually, probably a little longer than that, maybe more like 10 years ago. And I became, first of all, a huge fan of the Diaz brothers. I loved both of them. Nathan especially. Ultimate Fighter Season 5 was when I really started focusing back on the UFC again, and I adored Nathan Diaz. I thought he was just so entertaining, such a great fighter, such an interesting personality. And when I got to see his brother as well, I was just blown away by the way both of them fought. I loved that, again, as with Royce Gracie, even though Nathan and Nick are both excellent boxers, their real magic for me was when they would get on the ground. I'll never forget the Ultimate Fighter semi-final between Nathan and Gray Maynard. When in the first round Nathan got cut up, Gray Maynard, actually not the best stand-up fighter. He's much better known as a really powerful wrestler. But Nathan, obviously well known for getting cut quite easily. And so he did get cut, and it looked rough for him, but then they ended up on the mat, and Nathan was able to submit Gray from on bottom. And I was just so excited by that. But again, it never really seemed like something that was possible for me. And then, as time went on even more, I started watching more and more on YouTube of various jiu-jitsu personalities talking. And of course, amongst the most famous of those are Huron and Henner Gracie. The Gracie Breakdown series were really interesting in terms of understanding how jiu-jitsu worked. But then when they were developing the Gracie University, they were explaining some of the very basic movements, some of the very basic techniques that I looked at and I thought, I actually probably could do that. And the way that they presented it made me think that, yeah, this might be something that I really could do. But then almost exactly 5 years ago, just almost 5.5 years ago now, I got a cancer diagnosis. I had testicular cancer. And, it wasn't quite like I realized how short my life was and how I had to get out there and chase life. It wasn't like that, but I did certainly have a sense that I needed to stop wasting time, that I needed to kind of do things that I shouldn't let myself be stopped doing things just because they're difficult or maybe frightening. I became much more kind of conscious of that. That didn't make me start doing jiu-jitsu right away. I had, at the time when I had my cancer, I also had a frozen shoulder. I still had the knee problems. I was developing worse and worse problems with my hips. And so I thought, it's still really not for me. But then as I approached my 40th birthday, which was 3.5 years ago, I decided that no, this is something that if I'm ever going to do it, I have to do it now. And there was an excellent video that Huron Henner put out talking about rolling until you're 90, until you're, the age Helio Gracie was when he died. And he was still rolling until weeks before his death. And I realized that maybe it is possible. Maybe it is possible to start at the age of 40 and still get somewhere. Obviously, as I say, I was still concerned about my body, but I saw clips on YouTube of somebody fighting with only one leg. Another clip of somebody fighting with a hand missing. I heard about, for example, Jean-Jacques Machado, who became one of the greatest fighters of all time, with fingers missing on one of his hands, so he couldn't take grips the way that most people do. And there was also the John Danaher interview on the Joe Rogan Experience, where he talked about his hip problems, and that was really one of the real pushes for me, was that, because John injured himself playing rugby as a child in New Zealand, and his knee doesn't straighten properly, which is the problem I have in both my knees. And as a result, he has really bad pain, or he had really severe pain in his hip. He has since, I believe, had a hip replacement, and he's doing much better now. But I thought, well, if Jean-Jacques Machado can be that good with that disability, and if John Danaher can become arguably the greatest coach in the history of jiu-jitsu with a very, very similar condition to the one I have, then there really isn't any excuse for me not to give this a try. And so I did. And as I said before, exercise was something I'd never really been able to muster any enthusiasm for. Running was never my thing because of my knee problems. Swimming, even, people would suggest swimming, and I found that actually the strain on my knees, the pain that I had from swimming really wasn't significantly better than the pain that I got running. So that really wasn't for me either. And especially with the frozen shoulder, it's very difficult to swim when you can't move your arms properly, or you can only move one arm properly. So I had never really been into weightlifting. That seemed kind of boring to me. It was difficult to motivate myself. And again, my shoulder, my knees made a lot of that very, very difficult. So eventually, I did try jiu-jitsu. I was interested in it. I was fascinated by the kind of body mechanics of learning how you could control and manipulate another person's body, and how you could use your own body in ways that you don't necessarily instinctively understand, that you don't expect, that you don't see in ordinary life. And yet once you see them applied, they make perfect sense. That was one of the things that really, really intrigued me. And so when I started training, I found that I can spend a lot of time on my back. I don't have to be on my feet or on my knees all the time. I can pull guard, and I can make people submit with triangles. I love triangles, by the way. Triangles are my absolute favorite submission. So that was something that I knew was going to be different for me. That was something that I could do. The social experience of jiu-jitsu as well, I think, is really interesting, because you're in a room with guys who are mostly younger than me, mostly a lot fitter than I am, mostly focused, well, a lot of guys in my gym very focused on competition as well. That's something that our gym is takes quite seriously. And so being in that environment, I was frightened at first, but as I got to be more involved, I realized that there's this kind of brotherhood in jiu-jitsu. And once those guys, the more experienced guys, the higher belts, even if they are, diehard competitors, they look at me and they see someone who trains regularly, who trains hard, who does his best. And so they still encourage me. There are other sports where I think it's harder to get involved if you don't have some level of ability. Other sports where you're working with other people. But with jiu-jitsu, I found that everybody remembers how difficult it is being a brand new white belt, and everybody understands what it's like to try and train with injuries. So once I explained to people what my situation was, I found that actually everybody was really supportive and really helpful and would work with me to try and figure out how to perform while still looking after me. I also found that my coaches were really helpful in helping me to adapt, helping me to cope with the fact that there were certain limitations on me. I don't have huge changes I need to make to what I do. There's, especially since I had my shoulder surgeries, I'm reasonably mobile again, and so I don't need to make huge adaptations. But that sense of kind of support and camaraderie and welcome that I got was something that I hadn't really experienced anywhere else in anything really that I've done before. And that was a really big... I think also my fitness, maybe not right now, but certainly before lockdown last March, my fitness was probably better than it's been since I was a teenager. I was not fit before, not strong, not really very healthy in a lot of ways. And I found that jiu-jitsu was something that I could work hard at, and that could, really get my heart pumping, could really give me a solid workout. But it was something that I enjoyed. And that was something that that was really unusual for me, having come from this experience of never really enjoying exercise at all. And as well, the intellectual challenge. I mentioned before this idea of kind of discovering ways of moving somebody else that you wouldn't necessarily figure out on your own was really, really interesting. That mental challenge was really great for me. And on top of that, being able to understand when I'm watching the UFC, that's a big thing as well. Being able to just make sense of what's happening on the ground. For years, I wasn't sure about a lot of things. And I remember one conversation with a friend, going back to Nathan Diaz again, the fight with Kurt Pellegrino, where the famous double bird triangle. I remember this friend saying, well, Nathan's doing that wrong. He shouldn't be flexing and giving the finger. He needs to pull the head down to finish the triangle. And my attitude was, well, yeah, maybe he's a little disrespectful, but he got the finish without pulling the head down, so why is it that you think he needs to pull the head down? And that's one of the reasons that it was so interesting to me to do triangles. Find out that actually you don't need to pull the head down if you get the triangle set up right, if you get the shoulder properly hidden, if you get it really tight, if you squeeze properly with your knees, then actually you don't always need that pull down on the head to finish. So understanding things like that, making, advancing my knowledge and understanding of this sport that I really enjoy watching was something that was really rewarding as well. So for me, jiu-jitsu is a lot of things. It's in one way a continuation of things that I enjoyed about professional wrestling when I was young. It's great exercise for somebody who can't do lots of other exercises very easily. It's a great social experience. I really enjoy spending time with my colleagues in the gym. I really enjoy that sense of working together and being part of something like that. It's a great intellectual challenge where I've learned things about the human body and about myself that I don't know that I would have learned any other way. And as I said, it's been the best kind of fitness builder for me that I've ever had in my life. And so that's why jiu-jitsu is important to me. Now, there are a million reasons why jiu-jitsu might be important to other people. Self-defense is one really big one. There are people who want to be MMA fighters and need to know some jiu-jitsu in order to have any chance of success in that sport. There are people who want to compete as jiu-jitsu fighters. There are people who come into jiu-jitsu gyms just because they know it's a really tough workout and they want to lose weight. There are all sorts of reasons why people do jiu-jitsu, and mine are just mine. Yours, I'm sure, will be different. So do please let us know down in the comments, why jiu-jitsu? What is it about jiu-jitsu that attracts you, keeps you interested, keeps you doing this thing that we all know is at times very, very difficult? I'd love to hear from that, and maybe we can talk about some of those different motivations, some of those different reasons for getting into jiu-jitsu that you have. If you're not somebody who trains just now, then also let us know, because I'm really interested to know what it is that interests you about jiu-jitsu. If you're not a participant, if you're somebody who's thinking about getting into jiu-jitsu, what are the things that interest you? What are the things you want to get out of your jiu-jitsu experience? And again, we can maybe talk about those again in future. But until then, that is all I've got for you just now. So thank you very much for watching. If you wouldn't mind, please do give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to the channel if you'd like to hear more. And until next time, thanks again for watching. Enjoy training, and I'll see you next week.